Okay, so here we are in week 2. It feels almost like week 6 at this point, but I hope you guys are doing well in this class and in your other classes too. Let me know if you have any issues or any concerns. So this week we'll be working through chapters 2 and 3. So for today, chapter 2, which deals with some metaethical questions. And metaethics has to do with the original kind of metaphysical and logical sources of the distinctions and concepts that we deal with in the moral or ethical terrain. And then we'll kind of transition from that point on Wednesday to a discussion of moral reasoning. And so we'll be taking up logic more explicitly, more sustainedly in that context then. And then next week, we'll move on to moral theories. And so we'll start talking about utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, Aristotelian virtue theory. And then finally, in the next week, we'll get to the last of those moral theories, feminist ethics, care ethics. And then we have the midterm. So before we get into, so I'd like to take some time to make use of the breakout rooms today to get you guys talking in some small groups about relativism and subjectivism. But first, I want to wrap up our discussion from last week concerning the relationship between morality and religion, because we were moving through that argument kind of quickly, the argument that we leveraged from Plato's famous dialogue, the Euthyphro, against divine command theory as one such metaethical view. And so, are there any questions about anything like that, or anything coming up in the class for me? Any confusion?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
On our inquisitive, so once like I get to 100%, I don't want to keep going and mess up my score. But if I like take a picture and email it to you or something, can we keep like practicing on it without worrying about messing up our score?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Do you guys like the inquisitive? Do you find it helpful? Or?
I thought it was pretty helpful because it has like it makes up more scenarios to like connect the vocabulary.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I appreciate the adaptive nature of it, and that the experience that you have as a student using it will be different depending upon how you respond, and how you weigh your confidence might be different from the experience of another student. So I think it's a pretty good program. I haven't had any issues with it so far. Okay. Oh yeah, so Noel just said, I'm pretty sure once you get to 100, your score can't go down. I was sort of thinking that. I'll check on that. Yeah, I'll confirm that.
Yeah, so when I got to like level 3, like a thing popped up and was like, oh, you can't get like lower than what 75 or something. But when I got to 100, I didn't notice that. Okay. So yeah. I didn't want to keep going, but I'll try it and see if it does.
Maybe when you guys are in the breakout rooms, I'll take a look at it and just confirm, because I think Noel is correct about that actually, but I want to make sure. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, so let's resume our discussion of divine command theory, and to some extent in beginning our engagement with chapter 2, we'll continue this, right? So it'll be a meaningful segue. But let me share the screen just to go back to the final 2 slides for that conversation last week from chapter 1. Okay. Okay, and so let's take this a little more slowly. So who can, just in your own words, articulate what the basis of divine command theory is? So those who embrace divine command theory as the true metaethical starting point, what is it exactly that they are endorsing? So what is the argument? So what is divine command theory exactly? Can anyone kind of state that in your own words for us?
I think it would be that things are based to be right or wrong based on what God says.
Exactly, yeah. So the kind of amusing example I was using last time was the difference between an action like helping an elderly woman cross a street versus stomping a baby to death, right? So if we hold the former to be morally praiseworthy, that is to say, we would consider it something good, and the latter, we would hopefully, at least all of us, would agree that that's something bad, so stomping a baby to death. The reason, so the origin, the source of the distinction between goodness in one instance and badness in the other would simply be God's will, which is expressed through a dictum or a command. Hence the name divine command theory, articulating the very source of moral right-making and wrong-making, locating that source in God's expressed will. And so we're looking at various problematic consequences or implications of divine command theory. But something to keep in mind, however, even as we point out what I take to be critical flaws in this theoretical approach, that doesn't mean that we're rejecting theology or rejecting theism or rejecting religion. And further, it doesn't mean that we're rejecting an important or in some measure essential relationship between religious or theological or spiritual traditions and ethics, understood to be the systematic investigation, philosophical investigation of morality. And this was made clear, I think, pretty well in the chapter. In chapter 1, there are many philosophers who, in practice, in terms of their own biography, their own intellectual commitments, were very strong, theistically grounded sort of participants in one tradition or another. And so Immanuel Kant comes to mind. He was an incredibly pious Christian, yet the theory that he gives us, which is in part a kind of metaethical theory for what it is that makes something right or wrong, was entirely secular, right? Now, there is a kind of moral argument for the existence of God that you can find in Kant in some of his later moral works. So in the so-called second critique, the critique of practical reason, but that's not really for us to consider at this point. But the important matter to take away from this particular point, however, is that you have, and we'll talk about Leibniz in just a moment. We'll refer to a part from the chapter where Leibniz is quoted, an important 17th century German philosopher. He as well was a deeply committed Christian thinker, but he had some problems with divine command theory. So then, importantly, we shouldn't conclude that because divine command theory fails as a sensible or intelligible or coherent meta-ethical position, that doesn't mean in any way that we ought to reject religious thinking or any sort of spiritual tradition, right? Okay, so just to make that clear. But here are some flaws with the theory. So from Euthyphro, we unpacked what is identified in the scholarly literature as a dilemma, specifically titled Euthyphro dilemma. But what exactly is a dilemma? So what does it mean to say that if we accept divine command theory, we find ourselves in a dilemma? So what does that mean? I'm sure we've all experienced dilemmas, maybe not of a religious nature, but certainly I would expect of a moral nature or other such dilemmas in our lives. But how would you explain that? What does it mean to be in a dilemma?
Kind of a tough situation, you don't know where to go. Both options seem bad.
Great, perfect. Yeah, excellent. I couldn't have said it better. So a dilemma is a problem, but it's something a bit more than a problem, because it's a problem for which the alternative solutions don't really present themselves as adequate solutions, right? They each, rather than being helpful conclusions to the matter, that is, conclusions through which you could end the problem, you could reprieve yourself from the dilemma, they actually just open up further entanglements, right? So a dilemma is like a path where you're pursuing some question and you come upon an obstacle, and any way around that obstacle would just lead you into more thorns. So neither answer, which appears forthcoming, is either plausible or acceptable for whatever reason. And so the dilemma in this particular case, and as many dilemmas are, this one has two horns to it, so to speak. So you could go in one or two directions. So if it's true that God is responsible for the difference between right and wrong, then that means that God had to come to this determination by way of a kind of decision. And so last time I distinguished two tactics or strategies by which a decision or a judgment could be pursued. And I said that on the one hand, one could do so randomly, in other words, arbitrarily, and on the other side, for good reason, as I have it here. Let me check the chat real quick. Yeah, right. So mutually assured destruction, either way you go. Thanks, Hunter. So we were considering one of the horns of the dilemma, and this is the one in accordance with which God, in this case, decides arbitrarily. So if actions are right only because God wills them, then many evil actions would be right if God willed them. And so God's commands would be without reason or arbitrary. But notice in the history of at least the theology surrounding our Abrahamic traditions, various qualities that we tend to attribute to God, whether or not we actually accept that God exists, just pursuing the theological tradition in terms of God's nature, there are certain things we claim to know about God, at least insofar as we're dealing with the concept of God. So leaving aside the existence or verifiable status or whatever. And what are some of these qualities that we ascribe to the divine nature? So what are some properties or some characteristics, supposedly, that define who God is or what God is?
Omnipotence.
Yeah, good. Omnipotence is one of them. So omnipotence meaning perfect power, right? Perfect, that is unlimited, unchecked creative power. What are some other ones? So when I'm asking about divine qualities, I'm really asking about divine perfections. So one such perfection is understood to be in relation to the being's creative power, and that's omnipotence. But what are some other important perfections?
The like moral judgment or his its ability to determine right and wrong, or
Good. So perfect goodness, omnibenevolence, right? And then in the chat, Noel just wrote immortality. Yeah, so omnipresence, you might say, unlimited in time and space. God is understood to be an eternal being by some lights, that is to say, not necessarily existing in infinite time, but removed from time altogether. So that's how early Christian theologian Augustine considered God's divine nature. So yeah, omnipresence, omniscience, so all-knowingness. So these are some of his perfections. But the reason philosophers understand divine command theory to result in some unpalatable and unsustainable contradictions is because it puts into tension some of these perfections. means that we ascribe historically and conceptually to the nature of God. So the perfection that's in tension here, that is, if we start with the first horn of the dilemma. So in responding to the dilemma, we might say, well, God chooses, say that helping old ladies is good and stomping babies to death is bad arbitrarily. Just like the example I used, if I wanted to prepare a meal for an aunt who's coming over to my house for dinner, if I did so randomly or arbitrarily, I would just flip without any sort of plan to a random point in the cookbook, and that's what I would prepare for her, right? So now I'm making beans and rice or something, or whatever, for no good reason. But the problem is, we know just on the basis of our inheritance of this kind of conceptual theological tradition that God is by definition perfectly good. That's what omnibenevolence means. Yet, if he decides the difference between right and wrong arbitrarily, well then that attribution, that perfection, in part by which we understand what God is now undermined, if not entirely contradicted, right? Because if it's true that God perhaps decided what's good and what's bad by a random coin flip, well, then it would also be true that he could re-adjudicate those differences through the same mechanism. He could just flip the coin again and now decide that helping old ladies is bad and stomping babies to death is good. And the only reason now that one is good and the other is bad is simply because that is what God has ordered. That is what he has expressed in the course of his will. And so that means that it no longer means anything at all to attribute omnibenevolence or perfect goodness, or even a more restrained goodness to God, because what is good at one moment is potentially bad in another moment. So logically, what is bad and what is good become interchangeable. They become equivalent, right? And so that leads us to a conclusion, if we're following through this logically. So we know that God is by definition perfectly good. Yet, if God decides moral truths totally arbitrarily, well, then that means that he can't be perfectly good. So we find a contradiction. On the one hand, God is perfectly good, and on the other hand, God is not perfectly good. And therefore, we have to conclude that divine command theory is false. But that's a little premature, because there's still the other horn of the dilemma. There's still the other option, and that is that God decides the difference between good and bad, right and wrong for good reason. So now let's look at that one. So if God decides the difference between right and wrong for good reasons, well, then it follows that God appeals to moral standards that are independent of his will, just like if I decide that I want to prepare a meal for my visiting aunt that she would actually enjoy, I reflect on some facts about her that I recognize to be true. So I know she likes lasagna, so I decide I'm going to cook lasagna for dinner. But how did I decide that? I appealed to some fact that exists out there in the world independently of my experience, independently of my consciousness, and most importantly, independently of my will or its linguistic expression, right? So the fact that my aunt enjoys lasagna existed anteriorly, that is, before I made the judgment, and in fact served as the locus or the basis to which I turned in my effort to make the judgment in the first place, which means that that fact exists entirely outside of my questioning, my thinking, my decision-making, and so forth. And so the implication here is that if God makes this decision for good reason, then there is at least one thing in reality that exists outside of God's power. And so one of those features that we ascribe to the divine being through our theological traditions, namely omnipotence, is now undermined. So in the first case, we found that God's purported omnibenevolence, his perfect goodness, was questioned or weakened. But now it's his perfect creative power, which is potentially put under check. So then, if it's true that God decides the difference between good and bad for good reason, then he is ultimately, even as a divine being, no different than any of us mortals, any of us finite existing individuals, when we have to make difficult and important moral decisions, right? We have to appeal to some more or less objective standard that serves as a guide or a measure by which we distinguish in the course of our own practical lives what is good and what is bad. And God would be no different. So in making that decision that helping old ladies is good, stomping babies to death is bad, God himself or itself or herself, whatever language you want to use there, was appealing to this standard, which is thus not in itself dependent on his will, right? And that would mean that we have to give up at least some of the substance of this purported omnipotence that we ascribe to God. And now in the history of theology, just as an aside, the most important theologians have opted to sacrifice a little bit of divine omnipotence in favor of preserving omnibenevolence, right? And why do you think that is? It seems like, especially from the point of view, perhaps from the tradition of our Abrahamic religions, which would include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it is of incomparable importance that we think that the divine being is good, right? So much so that we're willing to suggest that there's at least one thing that being doesn't have creative control over, and that would be the moral law. So does that make sense? What's going on in the dilemma here? Any thoughts about them or questions?
I mean, I have a brief thought.
Yeah.
I believe that if a Christian were to consider divine command theory, they would also agree that it's false, because they believe that God is immutable and eternal, and that they believe that he is objective truth and that it hasn't changed. So that they don't believe that at one point God decided that something was right or wrong, or that he continues to decide that. So I think they would also agree that divine command theory is wrong, because God exists as truth. He doesn't will it or decide it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks, Poppy. That's a very good point. And some might say, and this is actually in line with the view of Leibniz that I'll turn to in just a moment, who rejects divine command theory. But according to Leibniz, sort of in resonance with what you were just saying, Poppy, the cosmos or the universe is the best of all possible worlds. So it might seem pretty profoundly shitty to us, but that's only due to our finite, very limited perspective, right? But if we could gain some dominant view of the whole, that is, achieve an eternal God's eye perspective, we would see that ultimately everything is for a good reason. Although in the course of our suffering and our experience in the world, we can't recognize that. And some might find that offensive, but that is those who are actually suffering quite a bit. They might not find that very helpful. But also in accordance with this view, one might say that it is inappropriate to ascribe fickleness or mutability or change to the divine nature. And God's very being is identical with good, such that at the very moment of creation, when everything came into being, there wasn't, first of all, metaphysics, that is, existence itself and all its materiality and so forth. And then on top of that, there were these moral judgments encoded into everything. Rather, the idea is that all of that happened precisely at the same time, such that if God were to introduce changes into the moral fabric of the cosmos, that would actually necessitate an entire recreation, right? From the very rudiments, the very simple, primitive building blocks of the cosmos. He couldn't just take things as it all exists materially, physically, historically, and then change moral norms, because the moral norms are themselves built in simultaneously and intimately with everything else that makes up reality. So does that make some kind of sense? So God couldn't just change it, because any little change, and it's not really a little change that we're talking about, would necessarily entail the total recreation of all of being. Okay, so does that make sense? But I appreciate what you contributed there, Poppy. So any other comments or questions about that? Yeah, Connor?
So something that might be related to the discussion here. Some years ago, I had a discussion with some Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe they were, that were like, stopping by houses and whatnot. And I ended up talking with them for some time. And one of the things that was talked about was like why bad things happen. Why does God let bad things happen, or inherently evil things and whatnot, if he's good and also has the power to prevent them? And after quite a bit of talking with them, the conclusion that I think I reached was essentially so as to preserve the what I think is probably the subjective morality, where like people who like what you would see as these bad things, someone else might view them as good things, and so they're happening to also appeal to the other individual. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so some might say that evil exists in order, or rather as a necessary condition of the possibility of freedom, right? So because God created us as his most special creation, by the way, as free, then we have to be free to pursue evil just as much as good. And evil, by the lights of this traditional response, is understood to really be nothing positive in itself, but something akin to a shadow, the absence of light, right? So evil is not anything that exists, it's just the separation or distance from good. But some philosophers have had a very difficult time reconciling that justification for the existence of human evil, the kind of evil that results from human action or decision, from something like natural evil. So the destruction of wildfires or earthquakes or plagues or something like that. Because it doesn't seem to be the case that such examples of evil really do ultimately issue from the source of free decision making. So that's an issue that would require a different kind of response, right? And so that's, I would say, more strongly, more forcefully, that would be an instance in which the Leibnizian response, this appeal to a pre-established harmony, that is to say that everything is actually, albeit surfacely from our perspective, shitty, everything is actually the best it could possibly be. Someone might think, well, I don't know, did you live through 2020? It seems like some poverty of the imagination, to put it mildly, to suggest that that's the best that we could possibly have. But I don't know. But yeah, so that's a good comment. So let me just stop sharing there. And I wanted to, before I put us into some breakout rooms, I wanted to just share a couple passages from our textbook. So the first by Leibniz, and then the second by a 20th century American philosopher, James Rachels. And we'll talk about Rachels again when we get to the issue of physician-assisted suicide. So let me share the screen here. Okay, so I'll just want to read together these passages. So for some theists, this charge of arbitrariness, that is to say that the difference between right and wrong comes about simply through the articulation of a divine will. It's especially worrisome. So Leibniz, for example, rejects the divine command theory declaring that it implies that God is unworthy of worship. So here's what Leibniz says. In saying, therefore, that things are not good according to any standard of goodness, but simply by the will of God, it seems to me that one destroys, without realizing it, all the love of God and all his glory. For why praise him for what he has done if he would be equally praiseworthy in doing the contrary? Where will be his justice and his wisdom if he has only a certain despotic power? If arbitrary will takes the place of reasonableness, and if in accord with the definition of tyrants, justice consists in that which is pleasing to the most powerful, right? So implicitly there, Leibniz is drawing on this kind of traditional ethical discourse going all the way back to Plato, who in the first books of the Republic, so his most famous book, The Republic, was at pains to distinguish legitimate justice from justice as understood to be the virtue of the stronger. So in the first books of the Republic, Socrates is fighting against this character Thrasymachus, who claims that justice is just whatever the person in power happens to decide is what justice is. And if that's true of God, well, then that means that what presents itself as universal cosmic justice is really just despotism, is really just tyranny. Okay, but then defenders of the divine command theory might reply to the arbitrariness argument. So they might reply to this by contending that God would never command us to commit heinous acts. So some of you might have been thinking, well, God would never come down from heaven and order us to start stomping babies to death. He wouldn't do that because he's good. Well, that's kind of begging the question. Because if you ask, well, why wouldn't God order that? Well, the answer is because it's good. But you just said that good is decided by what God decides. So there's the issue. But so because God is all good, because of his supreme goodness, he would will only what is good. Some thinkers, however, believe that such reasoning renders the very idea of God's goodness meaningless. And this is what James Rachel says. On this view, the doctrine of the goodness of God is reduced to nonsense. It is important to religious believers that God is not only all-powerful and all-knowing, but that he is also good. Yet, if we accept the idea that good and bad are defined by reference to God's will, this notion, the notion of God's goodness, is deprived of any meaning. What could it mean to say that God's commands are good? If the statement X is good just means X is commanded by God, then the statement God's commands are good would mean only God's commands are commanded by God, an empty truism. And so that's logically where this horn of the dilemma falls apart, right? If good is simply identical in a logical sense with what God commands, then the statement X is commanded by, or excuse me, X is good just means X is commanded by God. So then if you want to say God's commands are good, all you're saying is that God commands what God commands. And that's not really saying much at all, is it? So that's the issue there. But are there any questions about this argument? So really what I want us to take away from this conversation is a recognition that simply appealing to an existing code of laws, even if handed down by a divine authority, is not sufficient in itself to remove the task from us of performing ethical reasoning, of engaging in this kind of moral discourse, because it seems that even if God exists, God would have to, insofar as we consider God to be a legitimately good and caring being, God would have to care about what's right and wrong, and not simply make random statements that we are to follow. And so, I mean, divine command theory kind of takes the view of those rather authoritarian parents who tell their kids, if they ask, well, why? Because I fucking said so, that's why. Now, sometimes that response from a responsible parent is in order, right? So if your kid is out there playing in traffic, like running around in the street, and they're doing it despite the fact that you have, admonished them in different instances, you might say, look, don't play in the street anymore. And if they ask why, you just say, I told you. That's why. That's all you need to know. But you don't think, as a parent behaving in this manner, you never think, yeah, the reason my kid should not be playing in the street is because I said so. You're making that case because maybe your kid is not old enough to really understand robust reasons, or maybe you're just tired of having to repeat yourself over and over again. But behind all of this, you know that maybe when your kid is a little bit older, you can have a real conversation about it or something. But notice that divine command theory is quite a bit different. When God tells us, do not steal, do not lie, do not murder, from the point of view of the divine command theorist, the reason that you don't lie, do not murder, do not steal, is simply because God said so. There is no deeper reason hidden behind there that perhaps God could, share with you one day when you're in heaven hanging out. And so for religious believers who hold quite centrally that God must be good, that's obviously inadequate, right? Okay, so any final questions or comments? Okay, so before we jump into the material assigned for today's discussion, I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of time to talk with each other in small groups. And so I want you to focus in your conversations about, I want you to focus on relativism, and specifically cultural relativism, because that's the major view taken in consideration alongside subjective relativism and emotivism that we'll spend time unpacking and ultimately criticizing. So based upon your engagement with chapter 2, so the reading, and also your own experience in the world as a moral being, I want you guys to focus on problems with relativism and also reasons to endorse relativism. So try to come up with a couple criticisms of relativism, and specifically I have in mind, again, cultural relativism, and then a couple reasons to justify it. And this is important because as I understand it, and in my experience as a professor, cultural relativism in particular seems to be the kind of pre-reflective, almost knee-jerk ethical orientation on the part of most undergraduate college students. So most of you, perhaps without really self-consciously entertaining these questions, perhaps find yourself gravitating towards relativism. And so I want to point out some major flaws in that theory. Almost no professional ethicists or moral philosophers actually accept relativism of any variety as true or good. So we're going to look at some really robust reasons for rejecting it. But I'd also like for you to consider why it's so common. There obviously has to be something worthwhile behind it. Otherwise, it seems it wouldn't be so pervasive. So consider some criticisms of relativism and also some reasons that would recommend it. So any questions before I put you guys into some breakout rooms? All right, so I'll do that and I'll let you know. I'll let you know when you should start wrapping up your conversations. Okay, so I'm going to create 6 breakout rooms. Each will have about 3 or 4 participants. So I'm going to create those rooms now and send you that way. All right. All right, welcome back, guys. Let's give everyone a chance to rejoin the group. Maybe room 4 is having a really good conversation. All right, I think we're all back. Okay, so who has some good insight that you'd like to share from your conversation to get us started? So first off, defining the phenomenon. So what exactly is cultural relativism? Does anyone think they have a helpful way of defining or explaining that?
I guess I can go ahead.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, thanks.
So essentially, in my understanding, cultural relativism stems from defining morality based on the societal norms. So whatever people commonly do or commonly hold to be true or wrong, that's essentially just what the moral code is. And so it differs from society to society.
Good, yeah. So then if I were to explain divine command theory by saying the origin or the source of the difference between moral right and wrong or good and bad derives from God's will, or at least the expression of God's will, then when it comes to cultural relativism, I would say the origin or the source of the difference between good and bad, right and wrong derives from what? So can anyone answer that based on what Poppy just said?
From your culture.
Yeah, exactly. So whatever it is, so it's similar actually to what we found metaethically with respect to divine command theory. So why is murder wrong? Because God says so. But now we're saying, well, why is murder wrong? Because our culture or our society, as evidenced by our existing moral norms, says so. So just like in the other instance, if God were to suddenly change his will or change his expression, then the status of moral wrongness or rightness would change. In this instance, if a given culture or society were to alter its dominant moral norms, well then that would be sufficient to change the difference between good and bad as understood from that historical vantage, right? From the vantage of one within a particular society. Okay. So did anyone come up with any good reasons to explain why cultural relativism seems to have such a foothold in our common ethical discourse, or why it seems to be so pervasive? Or what's potentially noble or good about it?
I have a thought if no one else does.
Sure.
Okay, so I don't believe that there is anything particularly noble or good about it. I think it's just the easy way out. People like to relate to the people around them. They like to hold the same things true, and it makes it easier to function in society if everyone believes the same things. If there isn't that discourse and that uncomfortableness, then it's just easier, and people like to take the easy route.
Yeah, so that's why one philosopher in the chapter described cultural relativism as a cop-out, right? It's a way to stymie rather than to work through difficult moral deliberations, right? Difficult questions. So good, someone, let's see. Yeah, no one wants to step on any toes. Yeah, so on the one hand, you can characterize that attitudinal source of this way of thinking as problematic, right? Wanting to avoid difficult conversation, wanting to avoid hard work, a kind of laziness, intellectual laziness, you might say. But on the other hand, isn't it also describable in more positive or laudatory terms to not want to step on other people's toes, to not want to offend anyone? We often identify that kind of sentiment with something like respect, right? So we think, I ought to respect this individual representing a different cultural milieu than that from which I come. Therefore, I ought to not criticize, or something like that. But something that we'll consider together is whether or not respect, or another way to put that particular approach, tolerance, whether these are in any necessary manner connected to cultural relativism or any other kind of relativism as we're understanding it. And we'll find that they're not necessarily so. And in fact, it turns out, as we'll see, that cultural relativism, far from supporting or endorsing a culture of tolerance or respect, actively militates against it. It can actively undercut tolerance, right? So then we would have a reason to reject it. And that's, so I've already given away kind of a reason, a critical response to cultural relativism. Yeah, so Grace says, though I think you can respectfully criticize. Of course, absolutely, right? And that's a lot of what we'll be up to in this class. And some might argue, rightly I would suggest, that respect actually requires criticism sometimes, right? So it's not actually evidence of disrespect. Sometimes, morally speaking, the appropriate response is questioning or undermining, even if not to establish your own power or your own truth when it comes to a difficult question, but to help someone along in their own deliberation, their own self-reflection, to, if not change their mind altogether, to at least have greater clarity, greater illumination as to why it is that they subscribe to the view that they do in the first place, right? Okay, and you can, as Grace mentioned, do so respectfully, right? Okay, so does anyone else want to add anything? Is anyone wanting to ask a question or contribute? We'll carry on this conversation, but wanted to pull up my slides at this point. But any questions before I do so, or comments? All right, cool. So I'll call on you as we go on, and as I've mentioned before, since I have a hard time seeing many of your faces while I have a presentation up, if you'd like to jump in, you can share in the chat or just unmute yourself and interrupt me. It's totally fine. Either way you want to do it. Okay, so beginning last Wednesday, we started talking about metaethical positions, starting, of course, with divine command theory, which we carried over for today's conversation. But here are some basic metaethical positions. There's objectivism, and then absolutism is a part of objectivism, but not all objectivisms are absolutist, right? So that's an important difference we have to recognize. Relativism, there are different stripes of that metaethical starting point. So from our chapter, we've engaged with subjective relativism and cultural relativism. Then there are a couple of these metaethical positions that were not discussed in the chapter. So agnosticism and nihilism, but does anyone have any insight on what those might entail? So what would agnosticism or nihilism be as metaethical positions?
The belief that there is no God, or questioning whether or not there is a God, and nihilism is just like thinking that there really is no meaning to life, or just questioning if there is or isn't.
Good, yeah. So you can have a religious agnosticism and also a religious nihilism, but here I'm referring specifically to moral agnosticism and nihilism, which could be independently of any sort of religious connection. So for example, a moral agnostic, when it comes to metaethics, might think, or would think, insofar as they're a moral agnostic, that although there could be some objective difference that holds between right and wrong, good and bad. It's somehow unavailable for human cognition. So it's a question for which we'll never have an answer, similar to how you characterized religious agnostics. And then when it comes to moral nihilism, someone might say, and this is more or less consonant with the view of Thrasymachus that I was talking about earlier today from Plato's Republic, who argued basically that might makes right. That good or right is just whatever who has the power says it is, which means, in this sort of nihilistic cynical posture, that there is no difference between good or bad. It's just an overarching and ceaseless power struggle, which is no different from any other domain in human life. But those are two views that we won't spend much time on. We'll talk very briefly about these metaethical positions. So divine command theory is not only objectivist, so if divine command theory is true, and if one of those commands is that murder is morally wrong, then then that is true whether or not you agree, right? And there can be no exceptions whatsoever, depending upon differences of historical condition or experience or whatever else. It's simply the way things are. And so this is, so I have at the bottom of each image here, the source of morality, because that's ultimately, for our purposes, what we're concerned with metaethics for. We're looking for the source of morality, or the source of the difference between good and bad as moral judgments. And then there's ancient Platonic metaethics, which is objectivist. And so for Plato, the source of the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth is the good, to agathon, the good in itself, by itself. And so this is, in our intellectual history, a point, or one point, where the typical division of philosophy we call metaphysics, which asks questions about the nature of reality and so forth, is not decoupled, is not separated or distinguished from axiology or value theory. So according to Plato, if anything is describable as good, if you say, oh, this is a good sandwich, or this is a good cup of coffee, or this is a good book I'm reading, or that was a good moral action that you did. All of these things, however different they might appear, are good insofar as they somehow participate in or manifest or represent the ultimate form of goodness, which is broader than any particular example of goodness. And so when I talked about the Euthyphro dialogue, this sort of approach to metaethics comes out there, in the sense that to understand what piety is or holiness is, the character Euthyphro first tried to explain what piety is by using his own efforts as an example. So when Socrates asked him, well, what is the pious? What does it mean to be pious? And Euthyphro says, oh, it's doing what I'm doing right now, prosecuting my father for a wrongdoing. And Socrates says, well, that's not an adequate definition. And why not? Because presumably there are other things that are pious that aren't you prosecuting your father, right? So examples fall short. Examples give you instances of the broader thing, but they fall short of exhausting it. Okay. And then after Plato comes Aristotle, and we'll talk in a pretty sustained and substantial way about this theory. And this is the theory we call virtue ethics, Aristotelian virtue theory. And this is also objectivist, although it's sort of, it can sometimes appear to students who are unfamiliar with Aristotle's conceptual vocabulary to resemble relativism in some ways. And so we'll talk about that later. But what does it mean? So Aristotle challenges Plato and says, it's silly to think that there is some universal capital G good that accounts for all goods in the cosmos, because what's good for a human being is not the same thing that's good for a beaver or for a tree or for a star, right? So we have to talk about what's good for humans. And this is where he comes up with happiness or eudaimonia as the summum bonum, that is the highest good that we pursue. Whatever is good in the moral political sense vis-a-vis human action is whatever is most conducive to one's flourishing, to one's happiness. So that might strike you as relativism, because what is conducive to my happiness or flourishing might be quite a bit different from what's good for you. But Aristotle doesn't think so. That's why we can be perhaps mistaken about what's good for us, about what's conducive to our flourishing. And so for him, it's still objectivist. So moving on, this is a 18th century Scottish philosopher, is a really cool like shower cap type hat here, David Hume, whose view of morality is, by some interpretations, reducible to a sort of cultural relativism. So you might say that Hume does subscribe to cultural relativism, and he's also identified with one of the major theoretical progenitors of emotivism, which came up as an issue or a point of discussion in this chapter. And so emotivism is a non-cognitivist view within the metaethical landscape. And what does non-cognitivism mean? Well, a cognitivist view is simply one such that insofar as ethics is a domain of human inquiry, of human questioning, well then through that questioning and inquiry we can establish knowledge, we can obtain real knowledge. So cognitivism says, when it comes to morality, that there are moral facts, and we can learn, just as we can learn about any facts in the world. There are moral facts, we can learn what they are, we can teach them to others, and on that basis we can better ourselves. Emotivism is non-cognitivistic, which means it says that there are no moral facts. So when I say something like murder is bad, that has to be translated to an expression of sentiment. It really just means murder, ew, or gross. Or when it comes to a debate like reproductive rights or abortion, those who align themselves with the so-called pro-life movement say, or anti-choice movement, depending on the language you prefer, they say abortion, ew. And that's just what it means to say abortion is bad. So that when you say something is bad, you're not actually communicating anything factual about the world, you're simply expressing your emotion. In other words, you're emoting. And so whenever you make a moral claim, you're not stating a fact, you're expressing an emotion, and no emotion can be wrong. It can't be mistaken, which means that when we disagree about things in morality, we're not actually disagreeing about any facts, which means ultimately we're not actually disagreeing about anything at all. And so we'll talk more about that later on today, and we'll probably have to continue this a bit on Wednesday. So here is one of the most important moral theorists in this intellectual tradition, Immanuel Kant, one of a handful, maybe 5 most important philosophers in the history of the discipline. And he maintains an objectivist position, according to which all of morality derives from pure reason. And so I talked a little bit about this last week, such that Immanuel Kant, as a believer of the inevitability that we will at some point encounter extraterrestrial intelligent life, Kant said that if we do encounter intelligent alien life from some other planet, as rational, as intelligent, they would have to ultimately come up with the same moral truths as us, because it has nothing to do with our unique material circumstances or bodily constitution or history. It has to do with our capacity for rational thought, rational inquiry, which isn't necessarily limited to humans. And it is for that reason objective. And then we get to relativism. So relativism as we've been discussing it already, is a metaethical position that locates the source of morality in a given culture's conventions or customs. And so this is a language actually that David Hume uses, that all of our sentiments or thoughts about obligation, in other words, what's captured in the language of ought, is derived at bottom from our emotional experience in the world, from our sentiments. Okay, so any questions so far? Anything confusing? Okay, so these are the perspectives on moral judgments that articulate metaethical positions that the textbook describes and engages with. So this is what we'll talk about. Objectivism, cultural relativism, subjective relativism, and emotivism. So objectivism, and based on the foregoing, so laying out all of these metaethical positions, we see that there are quite a few different ways that one can be an objectivist when it comes to morality. So most of the dominant moral theories, as we'll see, are in fact objectivist, but that doesn't mean they agree with each other. So for example, both Kantianism and utilitarianism, although they are diametrically opposed, as normative ethical approaches and metaethical frameworks, they are nevertheless both grounded within objectivism. And objectivism then is simply the theory that moral truths exist and that they do so independently of what individuals or societies think of them. And it's important to note, as I did earlier, that this is not identifiable with absolutism. And so an absolutist, as is the case for divine command theory, is objectivist, yes, but they have a more extreme approach to the matter, whereby they don't think that there's any room whatever for exceptions. And that's not necessarily the case when it comes to objectivism. So notice that objectivism can actually operate in tandem with a kind of agnosticism, right? So you might say, well, surely there has to be some objective truth behind all of this that establishes once and for all the difference between good and bad. But even if there is such an objective state of things, I don't think I can ever know it, or I don't think anyone can ever gain access to it. So in that way, agnosticism isn't necessarily standing in a kind of tension with objectivism. They could actually work together. But agnosticism, I'm not sure could work at all with absolutism, right? So there's an important difference there. Okay, and also it's important for anyone here who has heard of the 20th century writer and sometimes considered philosopher Ayn Rand. She's identified with objectivism, but that's not what this means. So objectivism as connected to Ayn Rand is not the same as objectivism when discussed as a metaethical theory. In fact, if you really tease out the conceptual building blocks of Ayn Rand's approach, which she labels objectivism, and the conclusion to which it leads, I think it's more accurately characterized as a kind of subjectivism rather than objectivism. Okay, so I don't want to talk anymore about Ayn Rand. All right. So what are some implications if objectivism is true? And again, the major moral theories that we'll be operating with are all objectivist at basis. Well, here are their implications. Moral disagreements can be resolved using reasoning. So if objectivism is true, that there is some identifiable state of affairs that we could look to for the adjudication of disagreements when it comes to moral, ethical, political matters, well then, however difficult those conversations might be, it's at least held open as a possibility at the very beginning. And this is because, as the second bullet point suggests, moral judgments and actions can be evaluated according to universal standards. That is, standards which exist interiorly, so outside of my reflection or my consciousness, to which I, as anyone else, can appeal, and we can appeal to these standards together and discuss them. Okay. Unlike objectivism, relativism takes the opposite point of view. And so let's talk just a little bit about subjective relativism. So according to subjective relativism, an action is good or an action is right simply by virtue of one's approval or one's acceptance of it. And as I suggested earlier, metaethically speaking, this is very much in concert with the way divine command theory operates. So helping old ladies cross the street is good insofar as that matches or mirrors or coincides with what we find in terms of God's expressed will. And so coveting your neighbor's wife is bad simply because God says it's bad. So on this view, if I think coveting my neighbor's wife is bad, then it is bad only because I think so. Right? So you see how that works? That's the source of the moral judgment or the moral conclusion. Okay. And so to go to the positive side, an action is right simply if you as a subject, that is to say as an individual subject, agree with it. And subjective relativism, as you might imagine, is much less popular than cultural relativism. Because then if morality is relative to my subjective thoughts and your subjective thoughts, well, it seems that as individuals within the same societal framework, within the very same culture, we could never come to terms with something as at least more or less consistently right or wrong. But we do seem to do that to some extent, at least. And so this is why cultural relativism is more popular. So some implications of subjective relativism. Well, if it's true, unlike objectivism, everyone is morally infallible. Because if what I take to be morally right is determined in that way, is given that status simply because of my sincere view, then I can't be mistaken about my view, right? Because the rightness of the action is determined by its consonance with the very language I use to characterize the situation. So then there can be no space in which, for me, even as a finite mortal being, to fall short of the truth, because in this instance, the truth is simply synonymous with whatever I think, right? So there can be no difference. Genuine moral disagreement between individuals is nearly impossible. Why is that? Can anyone explain that? So if subjective relativism is right, if this is a correct theory, well then why is it that genuine moral disagreement between persons, between individuals, would be impossible?
Both sides think they're correct, so there's no way to argue against one another. They don't have anything to back it up besides their own opinion.
Right, so it's just like arguing over what foods are better. So the example given in the textbook, so-and-so likes strawberry ice cream and the other person prefers chocolate ice cream. It would be like telling the first person, you're wrong, you don't like strawberry ice cream. Because when someone says strawberry ice cream is the best, all they're really saying is they think from their experience, from their taste, so connecting to the last bullet point here, according to their personal preference, strawberry ice cream is good. So that means we would translate strawberry ice cream is the best to I prefer to eat strawberry ice cream. So if I think abortion is morally wrong, and I subscribe to that particular conclusion on the justificatory basis of subjective relativism, then all I'm really saying is that when I say abortion is wrong, all I'm really saying is, to me, abortion is wrong. So if you tell me you're wrong about that, you're telling me that I'm wrong that I think abortion is wrong. And then I would just say, no, I'm not wrong about that. That's what I feel. And then you would say, okay, well, fine. I feel the opposite. And then that's it. There's no other reason to turn to. There's no standard to measure where one is falling short or where one has met a particular normative rationale for defending or justifying a position beyond its mere expression. Right? So then this is important because it seems like the weightiest, the heaviest, the most substantial problems that plague us as individuals living in societies, living in cultures, get reduced to matters comparable to arguing over what food is better. So that means whether or not abortion is acceptable, whether or not female circumcision as an enforced practice is morally acceptable, whether or not capital punishment, for instance, the death penalty is morally acceptable. All of these questions, which I think we rightly consider to be of significant weight, that is significant mattering, they're all just reduced to the same level of whether you think, chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream. And so that's a problematic implication of subjective relativism. Okay, so how is cultural relativism different from subjective relativism? And I think we're already pretty clear on this, but can anyone state that in your own words? So how does cultural relativism differ?
Because your views are based on what your culture tells you and not what you feel is your taste.
Good. And so concretely or practically speaking, what does this mean for one who endorses cultural relativism versus subjective relativism if, when it comes to subjective relativism, one cannot be mistaken? You can't be wrong about your view. Is that the same for cultural relativism, or if not, how does it differ?
I don't think it's the same because you technically have to believe what your culture says, or you follow what your culture says. And in other cultures, it could be wrong.
Good. So if you're, say, a member of the culture of the United States, and that culture is marked by the prevalence of certain moral norms, and you take issue with some of those norms, you question them or challenge them, or in whatever way consider them inappropriate or wrong. Well, unlike the subjective relativist, you could be wrong here. Your disagreement with the dominant culture amounts to a real disagreement, whereas in the first case, there is no such disagreement. But now that disagreement hinges on whether or not your understanding is in consonance with the dominant cultural understanding of the group to which you have been aligned, whether you have decided that or not. And so this means that moral disagreements within a particular culture amount to disagreements, it seems in many cases, on what it is that the culture actually endorses. Because you can perhaps be mistaken about that. You could be a poor interpreter of your own cultural norms, your own customs. So I want to look at an argument for cultural relativism. So this is the first time in the course, and we'll do this periodically. Especially on Wednesday. So we'll take up logic in a way that's pretty straightforward and sustained and rigorous on Wednesday. So now I want to look at a common argument in support of cultural relativism, and we'll use the tools of logic to critically examine how this argument works. So one such argument can be traced back to our very first historian. So Herodotus more or less invented the historical discipline, history as we know it, in his major work, The History. And in that work, he tells us of the different funerary practices of the Greeks and this culture known as the Calations. So the Greeks practiced cremation. They cremated their dead, while the Calations, on the other hand, were known to eat the bodies of their dead fathers. Now, each culture, as you might imagine, was horrified at the other, right? So the Greeks thought that it was monstrous or barbaric for these people to consume the flesh of their deceased fathers. And for their part, the Calations thought that it was barbaric for the Greeks to be burning the corpses of their dead fathers. So this is a clear instance of cultural difference, which seems to materialize in the language and thought of moral difference, right? Because we're talking about moral outrage as a response to the lived practices of these other peoples, right? So when the Greeks were critical of the Calations, they weren't criticizing their practices because they were inefficient or uneconomical or something like that. It was because they were found to be morally problematic. But is it true, we might ask? Is it the case that there is a real moral difference between the material practices, the funerary practices, the end of life attitudes and considerations taken up in these practices between these different cultures? Well, I don't know. That's what we can talk about. But here is to sort of systematically lay out in terms of preferences, or excuse me, premises and conclusions. And so we'll look at a sort of representation here, logically speaking, of the argument at play, and then we'll talk about logic more generally or generically. So here's a couple sentences, one serving as the premise. So this is how all arguments are structured, as we'll see. You have a premise and a conclusion, right? So the conclusion of an argument, presaged or marked by conclusion indicator words such as therefore or thus or so or in conclusion that, and so forth. That would be the major upshot or the major claim that you're endorsing or articulating. And then every argument has to have, in addition to that conclusion, at least one premise. And the premise is what supports or justify or endorses the conclusion. In other words, it gives a reason as to why someone ought to embrace or accept the conclusion that you're offering. So here's the premise. The Greeks believed it was wrong to eat the dead, whereas the Calations believed it was right to eat the dead. Conclusion. Therefore, eating the dead is neither objectively right nor objectively wrong. It is merely a matter of opinion that varies from culture to culture. So there are various ways, as we'll see, to criticize an argument, to undermine its inferential strength, that is the connection or relationship that holds between premise and conclusion. And we'll talk about those in some detail, but just your preliminary kind of impressions given this argument as it's presented. What do you guys think about this? Is there a way you might criticize this reasoning? So is it the case that the premise gives an overwhelmingly powerful reason to accept the conclusion? Or if that's not true, how might you take that premise and find a different conclusion or come to another conclusion than the one given here? Anybody?
I think the reason that I don't know how to combat this is because there has to be some objective wrong to combat that it's not subjectively wrong or subjectively right. But I don't know what the objective right thing to do is with dead people. So I don't know how to argue it.
Good, yeah. So, but notice that you might take an agnostic approach here. So, I mean, I'm going to talk about this in a later slide, but let's say I replace this language with some people believe, and this is sadly true at this current historical moment, but I could say some people believe that the earth is the center of the universe. Or I guess I have seen arguments about that, but let's deal with flat earthers instead. That's a bit more common, but some people believe that the earth is flat. Other people, on the other hand, believe that the earth is a sphere. Therefore, because that's true, that there are people who believe the earth is flat and that there are people who believe that the earth is a sphere, it's neither the case that the earth is flat or is a sphere. It's merely a matter of opinion that varies from person to person. So if someone presented that argument to you, what might you say in response? So some people think the earth is flat, some people don't. So there must not be any truth to the matter.
There's definitely a conclusion. It's just, you know, what you choose to accept, and can you convert the other person or give proof and evidence?
Yeah, so of course, you could come up with 1,000,001 reasons to support either of those conclusions. And even when it comes to the conclusion that we objectively, by way of science, understand to be true, many of those reasons could be bad. That is, reasons that tell you that the earth is round or whatever. But leaving that aside, someone still without any familiarity with the history of these arguments, so someone from a state of pure naivety even, might say, well, I don't know, it could be just that we're not sure of the objective fact. And so imagine we were posing this question 5,000 years ago or something like that. Someone still at that point in time, someone could have said, well, surely there is some truth to the matter. That is that the earth is flat or that the earth is not flat. It's just that we don't, at the present time, have the resources that we need to, in a satisfying way, decide the issue. So we might say the same thing about this. From an agnostic point of view, we might say, well, I perhaps don't know the answer, but that doesn't mean just because I don't know the answer or others don't purport to know the answer, that there is no answer, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, let me check the chat, sort of activity there. So B was asking, would cultural and subjective relativism intertwine? Because of culture, the Colossians believed it is right to eat the dead. The Greeks disagree, but the Colossians deem it good, so in their own eyes, it is right. Well, I still think we're straightforwardly dealing with just cultural relativism here, because we're not dealing with any individual perspective, say from within Athenian society or Colossian society, where they would disagree with the dominant convention of the day. But that could be the case, right? So you could have a Greek who reads Herodotus's account and says, man, what the hell have we been doing burning our dead? I want to eat my father when he dies. And so that would be an instance of subjective relativism, contrasting with or clashing with the dominant conventions of their society, right? But here we're just dealing with this kind of homogeneous Greek perspective versus a homogeneous Colossian perspective. Okay, so someone says there's unbiased facts that support a conclusion, but no matter what, there's always going to be people who object to facts because of subjective relativism. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important political point, I think, that has pretty profound implications for this disastrous sort of moment that we find ourselves in. That facts, even if they are facts, don't speak for themselves, right? Rhetoric plays a role here. interpretive, let's say, hermeneutics plays a role. So how you interpret the facts, how you can, in a deliberate way, actually manipulate a given interpretation of facts to support your own preferences. So there's this kind of cynicism as well from a political orientation, where subjective relativism is deeply problematic. Okay. So now, that was this kind of generic way to formulate the argument. Let's get, or excuse me, that was specific rather to the confrontation found in Herodotus between these two historical cultures. But now let's tease from that a broader sort of argument that could give justification for cultural relativism as a metaethical framework. So now we have two premises and a conclusion. So people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. Just as we saw, the Galatians want to eat their dead, the Greeks want to cremate their dead. Premise two, if people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. Then we can conclude that right and wrong are relative to culture and that there are no objective moral principles. So I want to come back to this argument, but first, and so I want to come back to this argument and talk about the difference between moral judgments and moral principles, since these are the dominant categories that you see informing the second premise. And that second premise is the crucial one when it comes to this argument. That's the really important premise. And that's furthermore the premise that we would want to challenge, because premise one seems to be pretty unobjectionable, right? It seems to just be a kind of anthropological or sociological fact. And that's really in alignment with what's called descriptive relativism, which is fundamentally different from ethical or subjective relativism. Descriptive relativism is like moral anthropology. It just says this culture at this particular time practices this moral system or endorses this moral viewpoint or something like that. It doesn't say anything about whether or not one ought to endorse this or that moral viewpoint. So let's talk a little bit about logic here. So this is just a sort of standard canonical example of a deductive logical argument. And I want to show you this just to give you some insight into the various strategies or tactics that are available for us in repudiating or at least challenging the conclusion of an argument. So here is the standard example. So premise one, all men are mortal. Premise two, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now notice, even if I simply gave you the first two sentences and didn't fill in number three, you would all be able to come to that conclusion yourselves. I didn't have to tell you that, right? So if you know that all men are mortal and you know that Socrates is a man, well, then you know that Socrates must be mortal too. So this is an example of a deductive argument in logic. And what that means is its rightness or wrongness is dictated by the concept of validity. And so that's a technical term in logic. This is an example of a valid argument. And what it means for it to be a valid argument is simply that given the premises, the conclusion must necessarily follow. There's no plausible alternative way to conclude. And that's because when it comes to a valid deductive argument, the information in the conclusion is already supplied in the premises. I'm not introducing anything that was not already presented in the premises themselves, which means that the conclusion is just a drawing out of what is already given. And so also notice that when we're dealing with a deductive argument, we don't really care about the concrete truth status of the premises given. So we're just assuming for the sake of argument that premises 1 and 2 are true. And we're saying if they're true, well then this statement contained in the third proposition or sentence also has to be true. It must be true. So does that make sense why this is a valid argument? But now consider this argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a man and he's ugly. This is an invalid argument. And why is it invalid? Well, because as I mentioned here, there's information in the conclusion that's not contained in the premises. Within the premises, which are supposed to support the conclusion, there is nothing said whatever about Socrates' appearance, right? So that is sufficient to render the whole argument invalid. But notice what's interesting about this argument. It's invalid, yet every sentence, the two sentences of the premises and the sentence of the conclusion, they're all true. And I'm not, being an asshole. Socrates was famously ugly. I mean, he recognized it himself. It's fodder for quite a bit of conversation in Platonic dialogues. So every sentence is true, but it's invalid. So that tells you that validity is a structural feature of an argument and has really nothing to do with the determinate content of what's expressed in the language. It has to do with the relationship between premises and conclusion. And so just in case you didn't believe me, there's Socrates. Right? Okay. So now, before I go on to that, let's go back to this argument. Is this a valid argument based on how we just define validity when it comes to deductive proofs? So given the two premises, is it the case that the conclusion necessarily follows, that there's no plausible alternative way to conclude? Well, it could be just what I suggested earlier, right? From an agnostic point of view, you might say, just because what people seem to know or think about something, and you find disagreement in those ways of knowing and thinking, that's not sufficient to conclude that we're dealing with objective standards here. Or that is to say, it's not sufficient to conclude against the reality of any such existing objective standard. It could simply be that all of those cultures, in fact, are wrong, that none of them are doing what they should be doing. And so that's a different way to conclude, which means it's not a valid argument. It could be a kind of probabilistic argument. So you could say probably there's no such thing as objective right and wrong, but that's not the same thing as a strong deductive conclusion in that direction. And then we might ask about the difference between moral judgments and moral principles. So here's another way to criticize the argument. So even if we accept that it's valid, so there are two strategies to undermine the conclusion of a deductive argument. You can do what we just tried to do and say that it's invalid, in which case the premises do not necessarily guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Or if they do, you could say, regardless, I think that at least one of the premises is false. So for example, take an argument like this. The moon is made of green cheese. All cheese is delicious. Therefore, the moon is delicious. That's a valid argument, right? That is a 100% unquestionable valid argument, because given those premises, one, that the moon is made of cheese, two, that all cheese is delicious, you have to conclude that the moon would be delicious, right? But of course, that doesn't make it a good argument because you would just say, well, both of those premises are complete nonsense, right? So here we might say, even if this is a valid argument, we could at least challenge the truth of one of the premises. So I've suggested that the first premise is pretty strong. I wouldn't want to contest that. But what about the second premise? Well, here's where we have to get some clarity as to the difference between moral judgments and moral principles. So if a people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then right and wrong are relative and there are no objective principles. I would say that's a false statement. So think about the confrontation between the Greeks and the Galatians, or the example given in our chapter from the textbook about how there might be a society that, you know, kills their elder males on the 60th birthday, right? If you remember that example. But let's just take the Greeks and the Galatians. And so we're almost out of time. We'll pick this up on Wednesday before we get into moral reasoning. This is, of course, connected to moral reasoning. But so the Greeks judge that it is good to cremate their dead and bad to consume their dead. The Galatians judge that it is good to consume their dead and not to cremate their dead. But does this mean that they're operating on fundamentally different moral principles? What do you guys think about them?
They could be doing, each one of them could be essentially coming to their respective conclusion by the same means, kind of. Like they might both, like the Greeks are cremating out of some belief that it benefits, I don't know, some kind of afterlife condition, whereas maybe I can't remember the name of the other group, is eating theirs for the same exact reason. But
good, perfect. Yeah, so let's say their principle is one of respect, right? So the Greeks want to cremate their dead out of respect for their dead. The Galatians want to eat their dead out of respect for their dead. They both want to respect their dead. That is to say, when it comes to the moral principle that respect ought to be afforded for those in our society who depart us upon material death. But they come because of various non-moral facts, non-moral reasons, facts that have to do with the material conditions that make up their society, the social conditions that determine how they relate to each other in their society. Those are non-moral facts which result in a different conclusion, but they still agree that respect ought to be given to their dead, right? So the principle is the same, but the non-moral facts are sufficiently different to bring about a difference in conclusion, which, because it's dealing with a very important moral matter, it seems to those who are coming across these different approaches in their experience to be a mark or an indication of different moral principles. But if you don't subscribe to cultural relativism, which would say, oh, okay, well, they can do that and I'll do this, you actually engage in a conversation. And as a Galatian, you could learn why the Greeks do what they do. And as a Greek, you could learn why the Galatians do what they do. And it turns out you're actually closer together on the most important aspect of this issue than you previously thought, right? And so think of an issue like abortion, since nobody is really recommending eating their dead anymore. Think of an issue like abortion. It seems
Eating the babies?
yeah, or eating babies. But when it comes to abortion, it's largely, not always I would suggest, but largely the case of differences in concept, such as personhood, when it is that personhood exists, right? Because those who subscribe to pro-life or those who subscribe to pro-choice all more or less agree that murder is wrong. It's simply understanding when murder is happening that's the issue. And that is something ultimately non-moral, right? The moral aspect at play is whether or not killing a person unjustifiably is right or wrong. But then the question that seems to stand in the way of any satisfying agreement on this issue is what constitutes a person in the first place. And that's a metaphysical question. That's not a question that we can answer by empirical investigation, right? You can't, as a methodological scientist or something, put forth an experiment that will decide when a person is a person. And that's why it seems to be one of those intransigent debates in our society, which we can't really get beyond, right? Okay.
I can see how this can happen with various religious beliefs too, like the key differences between different sects of Christianity. They all have a common belief, but they're disagreeing over a little detail.
Yeah, good. Yeah, exactly. So this can take place within religious communities or religious debates too, that actually can give rise to splintering off, the issuing of new sects or whatever else. So yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, so we're out of time. I apologize for going over. But we'll pick this up where we left off and start getting into some of the major objections to cultural relativism, and then we'll talk about moral reasoning. So try to read, or please read chapter 3 prior to our Zoom meeting on Wednesday, and we'll talk about that. And let me know if you guys have any questions or issues. And oh yeah, be sure if you haven't done so already to take care of your attendance for today on Moodle. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Let me know if you have any questions. See ya.